People really think banks are miracle machines on Christmas, don't they? He joked, pointing a finger at Elena as if she were the afternoon's entertainment. A few people answered with thin, nervous laughter, responding more to his power than to the words themselves. Behind her, a woman in a crisp white blouse clasped her hands near her mouth, eyes wide with second-hand shame, while a man in a dark suit lifted his fingers to his lips as if trying to swallow his own reaction. Elena did not move. She kept her shoulders squared, breathing through the burn in her cheeks. The Christmas lights blurred on the marble floor, and for a moment the entire lobby felt distant, like a movie she was trapped inside but could not pause. The bank, dressed for the season, seemed to mock her with its warmth. Garlands of gold and red wrapped the tall columns. Glass ornaments caught the light, and soft carols floated from hidden speakers above the murmur of polished shoes and expensive perfume. Elena's clothes were the wrong kind of red, faded instead of rich, practical instead of festive, and the frayed strap of her purse cut into her palm as she clutched it. In her other hand, the small plastic card dug into her skin, the letters of her mother's name worn almost smooth with time. It was supposed to be nothing, a forgotten thing, until hunger and fear turned it into a last, fragile hope. It had begun innocently enough at the main counter, with a young teller whose smile was professional but kind. "I'd like to check the balance on this account, please," Elena had said, trying to keep her voice steady as she slid the old card across the cold surface. The teller had inserted it, frowned at the outdated account, and then looked apologetically toward the far end of the hall. There, on a slightly raised platform, sat the dark wooden desk that everyone seemed to orbit around, occupied by a man whose suit was worth more than Elena's yearly rent. "I'm going to need Mr. Hale to authorize this," the teller had murmured, gesturing for Elena to follow. Victor Hale had been laughing even before she reached him, pen poised over a stack of documents, two executives leaning in as if his every word were a stock tip. He looked up only when the teller spoke his name, his gaze flicking from the worn card to the woman who owned it. His eyes traveled over the cheap red coat, the jeans gone pale at the knees, the hair pulled back without polish or care. Something in his expression sharpened, not with curiosity but with amusement, the kind that curls at the edges like smoke. The teller's voice grew smaller as she explained the old account, and Victor's grin grew larger, stretching wide enough to fill the space between them. Now, as the echo of his joke faded, he plucked the card from the counter and slid it into the terminal on his desk with a careless flourish, as if he were humoring Achild. "Let's see what Santa left you, shall we?" he said, his tone still bright with cruel confidence. The machine beeped once, a high, clear sound that seemed louder than the music and conversation combined. Elena kept her eyes locked on his face, refusing to glance at the screen, because she already knew what it would show. Nothing, or almost nothing, and another door closing in her life. But as the numbers appeared, Victor's smile faltered, then stalled, and in that tiny, fragile pause, the entire balance of the marble hall shifted, though no one yet understood just how far it was about to tip. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The lobby that had been full of murmurs and music now felt like it had been wrapped in glass, every sound sealed outside. Victor stared at the screen, the bright digits reflected in his eyes, his hand still resting on the card as if letting go might make the numbers vanish. The executives beside him leaned in, then quickly leaned back, unable to disguise their shock. Elena watched him, searching his face for the familiar smirk, for the punchline she had been bracing herself to endure. Instead, she saw something new, disbelief, and beneath it a flicker of something that looked a lot like fear. "Miss Morales," Victor said at last, her name coming out slower than his usual brisk cadence. "Could you step into my office for a moment?" The teller flinched at his change in tone, then nodded quickly, gesturing toward a glass-walled room off to the side. No one laughed now. People pretended to study their phones, their forms, their reflections in the polished floor, but their eyes kept drifting back to the woman in the cheap red coat. Eleanor felt their stares like cold hands on her back as she turned away from the desk. The receipt crinkled softly in her fist, the only sound that seemed to belong to her in all that marble and gold. Inside the small office, the world grew quieter still. A simple desk, 2 chairs, a framed black-and-white photograph of the bank from decades ago, everything neat, controlled, orderly. Elena sat where the teller indicated, her knees close together, the purse strap still looped over her shoulder like armor she didn't know how to remove. Victor closed the door behind them with a soft click that felt too final, the glass walls turning the busy lobby into a silent pantomime. From here she could see the woman in the white blouse speaking in a low voice to the man in the dark suit, their faces tight, their eyes full of the scene they had just witnessed. Victor remained standing for a moment, as if he hadn't quite decided who he needed to be in this room. The easy charm he had worn in the lobby no longer fit. It hung off him like a suit, a size too big. He cleared his throat, then pulled out the chair opposite Elena and sat down, folding his hands on the desk with deliberate care. "There appears to be a significant balance associated with your account," he began, the practiced smoothness returning to his voice, though not entirely, "and I need to confirm a few details before we proceed." Elena swallowed, the words "significant balance" ringing in her ears like a phrase from a language she didn't speak. "Is it a mistake?" she asked, finally daring to look at the slip in her hand, though the numbers still refused to make sense. Her mother's name, her own name, the long string of digits, none of it connected to the life she knew, the overdue rent, the half-empty fridge, the Christmas list she had rewritten a dozen times to make it smaller than Nico's dreams. Victor hesitated, and in that hesitation she sensed something he probably didn't intend to reveal. Respect, or maybe caution. "No," he said, choosing each word as if it might be used against him. "It isn't a mistake, but it's also not simple." The chapter of laughter was over. In the heavy silence that followed, Eleanor felt the shape of her life bending towards something unknown, and could not tell if it was salvation or another, far more dangerous trap. The night before the bank, the apartment had smelled faintly of onions and dish soap, the kind of scent that lingered after a meal that wasn't quite enough. Elena stood in front of the open fridge, its weak yellow light falling over a carton of milk with tomorrow's date, half a loaf of bread, and a lonely carrot rolling in the drawer. Behind her, the radiator clanged and sighed, doing its best against the December cold that crept through the old windows. Nico sat at the small kitchen table, legs swinging, carefully opening the next door on his cheap cardboard advent calendar. "It's a star," he announced, holding up the tiny piece of chocolate-like treasure. She smiled because he was watching and crossed the room to kiss his hair. "A lucky star," she said, even as she calculated silently whether the remaining groceries could stretch until payday, which had already been stretched twice by excuses she knew her boss was tired of giving. On the counter beside the sink, a stack of envelopes sat like a small wall, electricity, gas, rent, each with red print bleeding across the front. One envelope was different, heavier, cream-colored with the landlord's name stamped hard at the top. She hadn't opened it yet. She didn't need to read the words to feel the threat curled inside. It sat there through dinner, as if listening to every laugh she forced out for Nico's sake. Later, when he was asleep, the apartment felt too quiet. The television flickered with a Christmas movie she wasn't really watching. Couples kissing in the snow, living rooms bright with decorations that matched nothing in her world. Elena sat on the edge of the sofa with a mug of tea gone cold between her hands, staring at the landlord's envelope. Her fingers finally tore it open, and the words jumped out at her. Final notice, eviction, 7 days. The letters blurred as tears filled her eyes, hot and sudden, not because she was surprised, but because she was so very tired of pretending she could outrun the math. Somewhere in the hallway, a neighbor laughed, and the sound felt cruel without meaning to be. She went to the bedroom she shared with Nico and knelt beside his mattress, watching him breathe, his lashes resting on his cheeks, his small hand still curled around the toy truck he refused to sleep without. "I'm going to fix this," she whispered, more to the dark than to him, because promises felt safer when no one else heard them. On the dresser, next to a small framed photo of her mother, sat an old tin box painted with chipped blue flowers. It had been roses, once full of sewing needles and buttons. Now it held other leftovers from a life that seemed kinder in memory than it had ever been in truth. Bus tickets, a broken rosary, a folded recipe written in looping Spanish script. And at the very bottom, under everything else, the card. She lifted it carefully, as if it were fragile glass instead of plastic, her thumb tracing the name Rosa Morales embossed near the top. She could almost hear her mother's voice again, half teasing, half serious. "This is for the day you really need it, mi niña. Not for shoes, not for fun. For when you have nothing left." Elena had kept it out of habit and sentiment, assuming there was maybe a handful of dollars attached, if anything at all. But tonight, with the landlord's threat on the table and her son's future pressed against her ribs like a fist, the card felt heavier, different. Heart pounding, she slipped it into her wallet, and as she closed the tin box, one thought rang louder than the old radiator and the television and her own fear combined. Tomorrow, she would find out exactly what the day you really need it meant. High above the city, in a tower of glass that caught the winter sun like ice, Victor Hale's office looked down on everything he believed he had conquered. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, a forest of lights and steel that responded to the smallest movements of his pen. On the wall behind his desk, framed magazine covers displayed his face beside phrases like "Visionary of the Year" and "The Man Who Never Loses." The desk itself was a long slab of dark wood, uncluttered except for a silver pen set, a single photo frame faced away from visitors, and piles of contracts arranged with military precision. For Victor, order meant control, and control was the only language he still trusted. His mornings rarely began with quiet, they began with numbers. Profit reports glowed on his screen, graphs rising like staircases, each line another step away from the boy who'd once shared a bedroom with 2 brothers and a leaking roof. Assistants came and went with schedules, coffee and problems to be solved before they became visible. "You're closing the year stronger than anyone in the market, sir," his chief of staff remarked, placing a fresh folder in front of him. Victor skimmed it, already thinking 3 deals ahead. Winning had become less a thrill and more a habit, something his bones expected, like breathing. The only thing that interrupted the rhythm was the photograph he kept turned away from visitors. Sometimes, when no one was looking, he'd spin it toward himself and stare at the image, a younger Victor in a wrinkled shirt, his arm around a teenage girl with his eyes and her mother's dimples. She was laughing at something outside the frame, carefree in a way he barely remembered. Now she lived 2 time zones away, sending occasional emails about charity projects and community gardens he never understood. The last time they'd spoken on the phone, she'd said, "You care more about balance sheets than people, Dad," and he'd answered with silence that lasted months. That afternoon, the bank acquisition was just another move on a board he believed he could see from every angle. The downtown branch was a symbol as much as an asset. Old marble prestige updated with his sleek, efficient systems. By New Year's, Hale Financial will own that logo. he said to the executives riding with him in the elevator, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his suit. They nodded eagerly, parroting back projections and synergies, assuring him that everything at the bank had been vetted, every account checked, every potential complication already buried in fine print. Victor listened, but his confidence came less from their words and more from his certainty that he could handle any surprise. Almost any surprise. As they stepped into the lobby, the marble floor gleaming beneath wreaths and ribbons, the bank president hurried to greet him, shaking his hand with the careful enthusiasm of someone who needed this merger to happen. "There is one unusual legacy account you might find interesting," the older man said, lowering his voice. "An old trust set up years ago by a rather eccentric client. We've never had activity, but it's sizable." Victor barely glanced at the file offered to him, tucking the information into the back of his mind with a dismissive nod. By the time he was seated at the VIP desk, pen ready and smile polished, he had already forgotten the warning, until a worn plastic card and a woman in a cheap red coat walked into his afternoon and turned that unusual legacy into the one thing he could not easily control. Victor stared at the numbers on the printed statement as if they were written in a code only he had never learned. The digits formed a balance more suited to corporate portfolios than to a woman in a faded red coat. The account name, however, was simple enough: Rosa Elena Morales Trust. It was the combination of those three words, his memory of the odd legacy file, the surname he now shared with the woman in front of him, and the word trust itself, that made his throat tighten. He laid the paper flat on the desk, fingertips resting lightly on the top edge, buying himself a few seconds of silence. "Is it really mine?" Elena asked, the question leaving her lips in a half-whisper, as if saying it too loudly might scare the answer away. She leaned forward just enough to see the heading on the page, her mother's name stacked above her own, like an unexpected blessing. There must be some mistake. My mother never had that kind of money. Her voice did not sound greedy. It sounded tired, bewildered, like someone who had spent years expecting bad news and didn't know how to hold anything else. Victor's gaze flicked from the statement to her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hand still gripped her purse strap as if it were the only thing that belonged to her. "There is no mistake," he said finally, the words heavier than most numbers he'd ever signed off on. "This is a legally established trust fund. Your mother was the primary beneficiary during her lifetime, and you are the successor." He cleared his throat, annoyed at the roughness he heard there. "It appears the principal was never touched. The income was reinvested. That's why the balance is significant." The last word tasted strange, inadequate. For a moment he thought of the eccentric client the bank president had mentioned, the one who had insisted on setting up a personal gratitude fund years ago. A flicker of recognition stirred in his memory and then slipped away like a name on the tip of his tongue. Eleanor sat back slowly, as if the chair might give way beneath her if she moved too fast. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. She had learned long ago not to cry in front of people who held power over her life. "My mother cleaned houses," she said quietly. "She took care of old people when their own families were too busy. She came home with sore feet and small envelopes, not this." She gestured helplessly toward the paper, as if the balance printed there belonged to someone else's story. "If she knew about it, she never told me. And if she didn't know, then why would someone do that for us?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither of them quite trusted enough to step onto. Victor looked down at the fine print, scanning the name of the original grantor, the conditions, the signatures. When he found the client's name, the missing memory clicked into place. Late nights at a hospital, discreet meetings, a stubborn old man who had insisted that wealth meant nothing if it didn't outlive him in kindness. He remembered seeing a caregiver's name scribbled in a margin once, Rosa Morales, and filing it away as an odd sentimentality. Now, in this glass office on Christmas Eve, the sentiment had grown into a fortune sitting between him and the woman whose life he had just mocked. "Someone your mother helped wanted to make sure you would never fall as hard as you think you have," he said, surprising himself with the softness in his tone. But even as he spoke, another thought slid in, cold and calculating. This was a massive, unadvised asset sitting in a bank he was about to own, and whatever guilt he felt did not erase the fact that he was very, very interested in what happened to it next. Outside the glass walls of the office, the bank seemed to exhale the story faster than any memo. A teller whispered to a colleague, a manager leaned toward a security guard, and in less than 10 minutes the phrase, "that woman in the red coat," floated across the marble hall with a new, hushed edge to it. People no longer looked at Elena as an inconvenience, but as a mystery, their glances sharpening with curiosity and calculation. She felt it on her skin when she stepped back into the lobby, with Victor at her side, the way conversations quieted, the way eyes followed her like invisible hands. The decorations still sparkled, but the warmth had shifted. It no longer belonged to Christmas, it belonged to money. Victor noticed it too, and something in him straightened, like a king adjusting his crown. If there was one thing he understood better than numbers, it was the way a room bowed, subtly, unconsciously, to whoever held the most power. A few minutes ago, it had been him alone. Now, it was him and the woman he'd just humiliated, bound together by a balance no one had expected. "Let's move this to a more appropriate setting," he said smoothly, gesturing toward a larger conference room with a long table and a better view of the lobby. He slipped easily back into his element, his voice firm, his steps confident, as though this sudden twist had always been part of his plan. Once seated at the head of the table, he spread out the trust documents like pieces on a board. "Miss Morales, you have to understand," he began, sliding a leather folder toward her. "A fortune like this is both a blessing and a responsibility. Managed wisely, it can secure not only your son's future, but your grandchildren's." Elena blinked at the word fortune, her hands resting carefully on the table's edge, afraid to touch anything. The legal language blurred in front of her: fiduciary, advisory capacity, market volatility. "I don't know anything about this," she admitted, shame prickling at her neck. "I didn't even know it existed until today." Her honesty rang clear in the polished room. "That's exactly why you need help," Victor replied, leaning forward, his tone softening just enough to feel persuasive rather than sharp. "You shouldn't have to navigate this alone. My team and I can structure the assets, protect you from taxes, from predators, from your own inexperience." The word protect wrapped around her fear like a comforting blanket, even as another part of her bristled at the idea of needing protection from herself. He slid another document across the table, this one thinner, its pages crisp and new. "This is a temporary advisory agreement," he said. "Standard practice. It simply authorizes us to manage the trust in your best interest while we figure out a long-term plan." Elena picked up the pen he offered, its weight unfamiliar in her fingers, heavier than the dish sponges and coffee pots she was used to holding. A dozen doubts crowded her mind at once. Her mother's warnings about smiling men in suits, the way he had laughed at her in front of everyone, the way he now spoke as if they were partners. But beside those doubts stood the image of Nico's face when he whispered his Christmas wish, the landlord's letter on the kitchen table, the gnawing terror of making one wrong move and losing everything before she even had a chance to breathe. "If I don't sign?" she asked quietly. Victor gave her a patient smile, the kind reserved for children and the uninformed. "Then you'll be alone with a very large target on your back," he said. The pen touched paper, her name began to form on the line, and somewhere in the dense forest of fine print, A clause waited patiently to turn this moment of hope into a debt she did not yet know she was incurring. The change began almost immediately, though nothing in her apartment had moved an inch. The fridge still hummed its tired song, the wallpaper still peeled in the corner near the window, and the radiator still rattled like loose bones. But Eleanor felt the difference in the way her landlord's voice changed when she handed over cash for the full rent, plus what she owed. He blinked, startled, then smiled too wide, his eyes sliding past her to scan the hallway as if cameras might be watching. Of course, Miss Morales," he said, suddenly adding Miss, where he'd once just barked her last name. "If you ever, need anything, you come straight to me, yes?" The offer sounded less like kindness and more like a hand reaching into her pockets. The neighbors noticed too. Mrs. Alvarez, who had never asked more than, "How are you, mija?" in passing, appeared at her door with homemade cookies and questions that tasted sweeter than they sounded. "I heard you're working with some big-shot banker now," she said casually, eyes darting around the apartment as if looking for clues. "Must be nice to finally get a break." Another neighbor, who had always complained about the noise from Nico's cartoons, offered to watch him any time you need, while lingering too long on the new coat Elena had bought on sale for her son. The word lucky floated around her like a balloon she hadn't asked to hold, bright on the outside and hollow underneath. Then Nico's father knocked. He stood in the doorway with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and a nervous smile that didn't match the years of silence behind it. "I've been thinking about our boy," he said, as if this were new, as if his absence had been a scheduling issue and not a choice. He talked about getting more involved, about sharing responsibilities, about legal arrangements that sounded rehearsed. When Elena asked why now, he shrugged and mentioned hearing things from people in the neighborhood, rumors about money coming in, and big changes. The word custody slipped into the conversation like a knife wrapped in velvet, and she felt her stomach drop. At the bank, Victor's team moved more efficiently than gossip. Emails flew, contracts were drafted, and internal memos labeled the Morales Trust as a high-potential asset requiring strategic positioning. Lawyers in tailored suits spoke in low voices about risk, liability, and the importance of maintaining advisory authority. Victor read every line they sent him, signing off on suggestions that tightened the bank's grip while outwardly appearing protective. He told himself he was doing her a favor, steering her away from bad decisions, shielding her from people who saw her as prey. It was almost easy to forget that he too had something to gain if she remained dependent on his guidance. Days later, when the thick envelope arrived by courier at Elena's door, she mistook it for another bill. Instead, it was a formal notification, printed on heavy paper with the bank's logo pressed deep into the top. The letter confirmed her status as beneficiary, outlined projected growth, and then, in smaller print, reminded her that, as per the advisory agreement signed on December 24th, all major decisions regarding the trust shall be subject to prior review and approval by the managing institution. She read the sentence twice, then a third time, the words scraping against something inside her. By the fourth reading, the meaning finally broke through. In the rush to save her life, she might have already handed the keys to it back to the man who had laughed at her in the marble hall. Christmas Eve should have felt different, she thought, but the apartment carried the same chill it always did. The tree in the corner was small and a little lopsided, its plastic branches dressed in old ornaments and a single new strand of lights she had bought with the first clean bit of money. Nico was asleep on the couch, wrapped in a thin blanket patterned with cartoon snowmen, clutching the toy truck she'd purchased weeks before at a thrift store. On the kitchen table, the papers from the bank lay spread out under the weak light of the old lamp, the words dense and shiny, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Elena sat in her usual chair, elbows on the table, fingers laced in her hair, staring at the lines she could read but did not fully understand. Her eyes kept landing on the same phrases: advisory authority, prior approval, binding for the duration of the agreement. The more she read, the less the wind outside bothered her. The storm was all on paper now. She tried to remember Victor's voice as he'd explained things, smooth and certain, assuring her she was protected, that this was temporary, that nothing would be done without her consent. But the letter she'd received sounded different from his promises, more like a rule than a reassurance. "Major decisions," she whispered, tracing the words with a trembling finger. What counted as major? A house, a school for Nico, a donation in her mother's name. And who decided what was best, her or the man who'd once turned her into a punchline? The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls closer, the radiator louder. On the counter, next to the bread and the last of the jam, stood the framed photo of Rosa, smiling in her faded nurse's uniform, eyes soft and steady. "Did you know?" Elena asked the picture, her voice cracking in the quiet. "Did you know someone did this for us? Did you know it would come with strings?" She imagined her mother's answer, not in grand speeches, but in the small phrases she'd always used. "Ask questions, mi niña. Don't sign what you don't read. Don't chase money so hard that you forget your own feet." She had broken all three in one desperate afternoon, and the shame of it pressed against her ribs. For the first time in years, she pushed the papers aside and cleared a small space on the table, just big enough for her folded hands. She hadn't prayed much since Rosa died. Grief had put a wall between her and the words she used to whisper before bed. But tonight, with her son safe for the moment and her future tangled in ink, the old habit rose up like muscle memory. "I don't know how to say this," she murmured, eyes closed, forehead leaning into her fingers. "I don't even know if I'm doing it right. But if you're there, I don't want to lose myself. Not for this money, not for fear, just show me what to do." The apartment stayed quiet. No angelic choirs, no sudden warmth, just the hum of the fridge and the far-off sound of church bells drifting in through the thin glass. When she finally opened her eyes, nothing in the room had changed, but something in her gaze had. She gathered the papers into a neat stack, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it in the old tin box on the dresser, right beside Rosa's recipe cards and the worn rosary beads. "Tomorrow," she said softly, looking toward her sleeping son, "tomorrow I start asking questions." She did not know whom she would ask or what answers she'd find, only that she could no longer let Victor Hale be the only voice explaining her own life to her. As the lights on the small tree blinked in uneven rhythms and midnight crept in without ceremony, Christmas arrived to find Elena caught between miracle and trap, still unsure which one she had actually been given. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains like someone trying not to wake the room. Elena sat cross-legged on the floor beside the dresser, the old tin box open in front of her, its contents spread out like pieces of a life she hadn't had time to sort. Bus tickets, faded receipts, a button shaped like a tiny seashell, and Rosa's recipe cards, their corners softened by years of use. She turned them over one by one, searching for comfort more than answers, until her fingers brushed against an envelope she didn't recognize, thicker, heavier, tucked flat against the bottom as if it had been hiding. Her name was written on it in her mother's careful handwriting. With a breath that felt too loud in the small room, she slid a finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a single business card, yellowed at the edges, with a simple black print: Daniel Cooper, attorney at law. Below the name was an address from a neighborhood she knew: old storefronts, laundromats, a bakery that smelled like home. On the back, in Rosa's script, were 4 words: in case of questions. No explanation, no instructions, just that quiet, steady assumption that questions would come, and that Elena would need someone who spoke a language she did not. The timing stung her eyes with sudden tears. She stood in front of the mirror, card in hand, and studied her reflection. The same cheap red coat, the same tired eyes, but there was something different in the way she held her shoulders now, less like someone waiting for judgment, and more like someone preparing to walk into it. Nico shuffled sleepily into the room, hair sticking up, rubbing his eyes. "Are we having Christmas today?" he asked, hopeful and innocent. "Yes," she said, kissing his forehead. "We are. But Mama has to run one little errand first, just for a couple of hours." She tried to make her voice light, but he frowned anyway, the way children do when they sense the heaviness adults try to hide. The law office was nothing like the bank. Instead of marble and glass, there was old wood and the faint smell of coffee, shelves lined with books that had been opened more than displayed. A bell over the door jingled when she entered, and a woman at a small desk looked up with a genuine smile, not the practiced one Eleanor had come to recognize. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. Elena held out the card with Rosa's handwriting, her fingers trembling just enough to betray how much this moment meant. "I think my mother wanted me to talk to him," she said. Her name was Rosa Morales. Minutes later, Daniel Cooper stepped into the waiting area. Grey hair, kind eyes, the slow, careful movements of someone who listened more than he spoke. When Elena said her mother's name again, something in his face softened, and he gestured her into his office without another question. He listened as she told him about the card, the bank, Victor, the trust, the agreement she could not fully understand. Then he adjusted his glasses, pulled the papers toward him, and began to read. The silence stretched, broken only by the scratch of his pen and the ticking of an old clock on the wall. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed from curiosity to a quiet, firm concern. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," he said gently, "and it seems someone tried to honor that. But from what I see here, Elena, Victor Hale has positioned himself to honor himself first." Daniel turned the pages slowly, marking sections with small, precise strokes of his pen. "This trust was not designed to be a toy for bankers," he said, tapping a paragraph near the top. "It was created with a purpose, protecting you, not controlling you." He slid one document closer to her, pointing at a line buried deep in the text, where most people's eyes would have already given up. "Here, your mother's benefactor insisted on a clause. If any agreement regarding this trust is made under pressure or without full understanding, you have the right to challenge and revoke it." The words seemed to glow on the page, a tiny doorway in a wall she thought was solid. Elena stared at the clause, then at him. "But I signed the contract," she said, her voice unsteady. "I didn't read everything. I just trusted him. I was scared." Daniel nodded, not with judgment, but with the weary recognition of someone who had seen this pattern too many times. "Fear is a kind of pressure," he replied. "So is humiliation. So is being rushed through complex decisions by someone who knows you're desperate. The law doesn't look kindly on that, no matter how polished the office or the suit." He folded his hands. "We can contest this. We can demand that the advisory agreement be reviewed and, if necessary, thrown out." Back at the bank, Victor's day began to tilt. An email pinged onto his screen with the subject line, "Request for full documentation, Morales Trust." Attached was a formal letter from Daniel Cooper's office, citing clauses he had barely noticed and language he'd assumed would stay buried where only specialists like his own lawyers would ever dig. He felt a stab of annoyance first, then something sharper when he saw the name Cooper. It tugged at a memory of earlier years, of meetings where older men had talked about ethics and responsibility in a way that had seemed quaint at the time. "Who gave her this man?" he muttered, more to himself than to the assistant hovering in the doorway. The bank's president called within the hour, his voice tight. "Victor, this could get messy if we're not careful," he warned. The trust's original terms were unusually protective. The old client was very particular about the beneficiary's autonomy. Victor listened, jaw clenched, eyes on the city below, as if he could will it to stay in its proper place. "We haven't done anything illegal," he said, his tone clipped. "Aggressive, perhaps, but within policy." Still, the words felt weaker than he liked. The memory of his own laughter in the marble hall came back to him, not as a triumphant moment, but as evidence he would not want replayed in any courtroom or headline. Meanwhile, Daniel spread fresh papers on his desk for Eleanor, outlining what came next. "We'll request a meeting at the bank," he explained. "You won't go alone this time. We'll ask for a full accounting of the trust, the original grantor's instructions, and every document you've signed. They're required to show us." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "You need to understand that this isn't just about money anymore. It's about your right to decide what your life looks like now that you have options." Elena swallowed, feeling both frightened and strangely taller. "When do we do this?" she asked. Daniel glanced at his calendar. "The earliest they'll agree, given the holidays? December 26th, the day after Christmas. Let's see how much spirit of goodwill is left by then." The conference room on the 23rd floor was all glass and chrome, a fishbowl suspended above the city. Elena sat on one side of the long table, Daniel at her right, his worn briefcase resting by his chair like an old soldier at attention. Across from them, Victor and two bank attorneys arranged their papers with the calm efficiency of people used to getting their way. Outside the walls, employees moved like shadows, pretending not to look in. Inside, the air felt colder than the glass itself, as if the room had been built for numbers, not hearts. Daniel began by requesting the full file on the Morales Trust, his voice polite but firm. One of the attorneys slid a thick folder across the table, its spine creaking as Daniel opened it. Elena watched his eyes move line by line, his brows tightening, relaxing, tightening again. Victor shifted in his seat, impatience flickering behind his practiced composure. "We've complied with every regulation," he said lightly. "This is a simple matter of ensuring Miss Morales doesn't mismanage a substantial fortune." Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a thinner section from the back of the folder, yellowed with age and clipped together with a small rusted clip. "These," Daniel said, laying the pages in the center of the table, "are letters from the original grantor. They were attached to the trust instructions." Elena leaned forward, her heart picking up speed. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate, the ink slightly faded. Daniel read aloud, his voice soft but clear. "I want this money to protect the woman who cared for me when my own wealth could not buy me more time. I want it to protect her daughter, whom I have never met, from men who know numbers but forget people." He paused, then turned one page so they could all see the signature. The name at the bottom made Victor's eyes widen. It was a name he knew well, a name that belonged to the man who had once taken a young, hungry Victor under his wing and taught him the first rules of finance. The man who had spoken, more than once, about how money without conscience was just another kind of poverty. "He was my client," Victor said slowly, the color draining slightly from his face, "and my mentor." Daniel nodded. "Yes. And it seems he knew you might cross paths with Rosa Morales' daughter one day. Listen to this." He read another line, this one shorter, more pointed. "If life ever puts her in your hands, remember, you are being watched by more than cameras and markets." The room grew very still. Elena felt as though she were standing at the edge of a story that had started long before she was born, one that her mother had walked through quietly while powerful men made choices above her head. Now, those choices had circled back, landing on this polished table between them. "Your mentor," Daniel continued, looking directly at Victor, "chose to tie his gratitude to this family, not to your institution. He wrote protections into this trust because he anticipated exactly the kind of imbalance we see here today. One frightened beneficiary, one very confident banker, and a great deal of silence in between." He closed the folder gently and folded his hands. "So here we are, Mr. Hale," Daniel said, his tone calm but edged with something unyielding. "The law gives Elena the right to reclaim control of her trust. Your mentor's words give us the moral ground to ask more of you than mere compliance. The question now is not whether we can undo this advisory agreement." He let the words settle, then looked him in the eye. "The real question is, are you going to honor the man who taught you everything you know, or prove he was wrong to ever believe you'd understand what trust really means?" For a moment, Victor said nothing. The city glimmered behind him through the glass walls, a sprawl of lives that would never know what was being decided in this silent room. He looked down at the letters, at the familiar signature that had once opened doors for him, and then at his own reflection faintly overlaying the text. The easy charm he wore in interviews and meetings no longer seemed to fit. It sat awkwardly on his shoulders, like a jacket borrowed from someone else's life. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its polished shine. "I haven't done anything illegal," he began, but even he could hear how small that sounded against the weight of the word honor. Daniel didn't flinch. "The law is the floor, Mr. Hale, not the ceiling," he said quietly. "We aren't asking if you broke it. We're asking if you're willing to rise above it." He slid the advisory agreement toward the center of the table, its black ink stark on the white paper. "This contract is stacked in your favor. It limits Elena's choices, ties her future to your institution's interests, and was signed when she was under extreme emotional pressure. You could defend it in court, or you could admit what everyone in this room already knows, that it does not reflect the spirit of this trust, your mentor's intentions, or basic decency." The bank attorneys shifted in their seats, their composure cracking at the edges. Elena watched the exchange, with her hands folded tightly in her lap, palms damp, nails pressing little crescents into her skin. She remembered the feel of his laughter in the marble hall more vividly than the numbers on any page, the way her cheeks had burned while his voice rose above the carols and conversations. Now, seeing him silent in front of her, she felt something else. Still not power, not yet, but a sense that she was no longer the only one exposed. "You laughed at me before you knew my balance," she said softly, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her tone. "You told a room full of people I was foolish for, hoping for a miracle. And then you tried to make yourself the miracle I owed everything to." Her words landed with a gentle finality that no legal argument could match. The young teller from that day in the lobby stood just outside the glass, summoned as a witness, her eyes wide as she watched. The manager, too, lingered nearby, arms folded, remembering every detail of that afternoon more clearly now that she understood what had been at stake. Victor followed their gaze, and for the first time he seemed to truly register that this was not a private chess match between professionals. It was a story with spectators, people who would carry their version of it out into the world, into their homes, into the way they spoke his name. Victor exhaled slowly, a breath that sounded almost like surrender but not quite. He picked up the advisory agreement, turning it in his hands, then set it back down without signing or stamping anything. "If I void this," he said, his eyes on Elena, "you'll be holding a fortune you don't know how to manage. There will be other banks, other men in suits, other deals dressed up as protection. I'm not the only wolf in the woods." His attempt at honesty came out rough, stripped of charm. For a heartbeat, the room balanced between the man he had been and the man he might yet become. And no one, Not Daniel, not Elena, not even Victor himself could say for sure which way he was going to lean. Daniel leaned back, giving the silence room to breathe. Then be the first man in the woods who doesn't pretend to be a shepherd while he's sharpening his teeth, he said gently. You're right. There will be others. But your choice can set the tone for what comes next. For her, and for you. Victor's jaw tightened. He looked at Elena again, really looked this time, not as a problem to be solved or a number to be managed, but as a woman who had carried more weight than most of his board ever would, and had done it without the armor of expensive fabric or legal teams. Something in his chest shifted, a rusted hinge remembering how to move. I was wrong, he said at last, the words heavy, scraped clean of polish. Not just about this contract, about all of it. He let out a humorless breath. I laughed because it was easier than remembering what it feels like to be afraid of a bank or a bill or the end of the month. His gaze dropped to the letters again. He tried to teach me that money is a tool, not a mirror of who you are. Somewhere along the way, I started using it as proof that I was better than the boy I used to be. He picked up a pen, held it for a second as if testing its weight, and then drew a line through his own name on the advisory agreement. This is void, he said quietly. Effective immediately. One of the attorneys began to protest, launching into a list of liabilities and reputational risks, but Victor raised a hand. No, he cut in, his voice firm for the first time since the meeting began. Our liability is what happens if this ends up in court or the press. Our reputational risk is what happens if people find out this is how we treat a woman whose mother saved a man who taught me everything I know. He looked at Elena, not as a supplicant, but as someone he now owed something invisible and enormous. You are the one who decides how this money is used, not me, not this bank, you. The simplicity of the sentence hit harder than any legal argument could have. He hesitated, then continued, each word measured. But I would like to make amends, if you'll let me. He set a separate document on the table, this one bearing his own name alone at the top. I'm prepared to contribute a portion of my personal holdings to a fund in your mother's name, a community fund for single parents on the edge of losing everything. You would have control. I would be a contributor, not an owner. The attorneys looked stunned. Daniel's eyes softened with a hint of surprise that bordered on respect. Elena stared at the page, the letters Rosa Morales Fund blurring as her vision shimmered. Her first instinct was suspicion, another deal, another trap wrapped in pretty words. But beneath that, something else stirred. The image of other women like her, standing in cold kitchens, staring at empty fridges and eviction notices, praying for a miracle that didn't require them to sign away their souls. I don't want charity, she said finally, her voice steady. Not for me. She touched the proposed fund with the tips of her fingers. If I agree to this, it's because I want my mother's name to mean what she made it mean. Safety, dignity, kindness. Not a favor you did to feel better about yourself. Her gaze held his, unflinching. So I need time. To think. To decide if I believe the man who laughed at me can really be the man who helps protect people like me. And in that quiet challenge, hanging between them like a bridge half built, the outcome of both their lives waited for her answer. The community hall smelled of cinnamon, coffee, and something Elena hadn't felt in a long time. Shared relief. The walls were lined with paper stars cut by small hands, crooked and perfect, taped beside faded posters advertising language classes and food drives. Folding tables, covered with mismatched cloths, sagged under trays of food, contributed by the neighborhood and quietly supplemented by the first, careful disbursement of the Rosa Morales Fund. Children rushed past in a blur of wool hats and laughter, their cheeks pink from the cold, their hands full of cookies instead of final notices. It wasn't fancy, not even close, but it felt solid in a way marble never had. Elena moved between the tables with a lightness that surprised her, refilling cups, sharing smiles that weren't forced. The fund was real now, ink dry, its rules written in language she understood because she'd helped write them. Daniel had insisted her signature sit beside every decision, and community leaders had claimed their seats at the table too, grounding the project in faces and names instead of abstract beneficiaries. And on the banner above the small stage, her mother's name was painted by a local artist, the letters looping and strong, Rosa Morales Community Support Fund. Elena swallowed hard every time she looked at it, a mixture of pride and ache catching in her throat. Nico darted through the crowd, a red scarf trailing behind him like a little comet. "Mama, look!" he called, waving a paper ornament he'd made, his smile wide and unburdened. She knelt to straighten his scarf, brushing hair from his forehead. "Do you like it?" she asked. "Our Christmas?" He nodded vigorously. "There's so much food, and everyone's happy, and you're not sad anymore." His simple summary cut straight through years of worry. She hugged him tight, breathing in the smell of crayons and cold air in his hair, and thought that maybe this was what the trust had always been meant to buy. Not luxury, but room to breathe. At the back of the hall, near a row of donated coats and a bulletin board full of handwritten notes, Victor stood almost still, hands loosely in his pockets. He wore no expensive overcoat tonight, just a dark sweater, and a look that didn't quite know where to land. He had insisted on standing behind the scenes. There was no speech with his name, no plaque, no moment at a microphone. When introduced, he'd been called one of the contributors, nothing more, and he'd accepted it with a small nod. Watching families talk and laugh, he seemed strangely quiet, as if he were visiting a country whose language he was only beginning to learn. Elena noticed him there, half in shadow, watching the life he had helped set in motion without owning it. She poured 2 cups of hot cocoa at the refreshment table, the steam curling up in soft ribbons, and felt her heart beat a little faster. This was not the marble hall anymore. She was not the woman waiting for permission to hope. She crossed the room slowly, the crowd parting in gentle, unconscious shifts, until she stood a few steps away from him. For a moment, she simply looked at him, at the man who had once pointed at her like a joke and now stood alone at the edge of her mother's legacy. Then she held out one of the cups, the chocolate dark and warm between them, and opened her mouth to decide, not about the money, not about the fund, but about what place, if any, this man would be allowed to have in the life she was finally choosing for herself. That night, after the last chair was folded and the last tray was emptied, the hall grew quiet again, leaving only the echo of laughter clinging softly to the walls. Elena walked home, with Nico's hand in hers, the cold air sharp on their faces, their breath rising like little clouds of proof that they were still here, still moving forward. The city lights blinked around them, less intimidating than before, as if they had shifted from warning signs to distant stars. In her pocket, her keys felt heavier than they used to, not with fear of losing home, but with the knowledge that home, this time, was safe. When they reached the apartment door, she paused a moment, grateful for the lock that no longer sounded like a countdown. Inside, the same old furniture waited, worn and familiar, but everything felt gently rearranged by something invisible. The fridge, once a reminder of scarcity, now hummed behind a door that closed on full shelves. The landlord's letters were gone from the table, replaced by crayons, school notices, and a flyer for the next community meeting about the fund. Elena set a pot on the stove, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who no longer measured each meal against the edge of disaster. She pulled out one of Rosa's recipe cards. The ink faded, but the instructions clear, and smiled as she followed her mother's handwriting into a future where old flavors had a new meaning. Later, when Nico was asleep in his room, his own room now, not just a corner of hers, Elena sat by the small window with a blanket around her shoulders. The city glowed below, headlights and windows tracing quiet stories she would never know. She thought of her mother, of tired hands washing someone else's dishes, of soft songs hummed in Spanish, of the secret courage it must have taken to trust that card to a daughter who had no idea what waited in its numbers. "You did it, Mama," she whispered, fingers resting on the window glass. "You kept your promise, and I'm going to keep mine. I won't let this money change who we are. I'll let it change what's possible." Victor's life, too, had shifted in ways no balance sheet could capture. In an office still lined with glass and headlines, he had turned one photograph around. The one of a younger man and his teenage daughter, caught in a moment of laughter he'd almost forgotten. The first call he made after the fund was finalized wasn't to a board member or an investor, it was to her. Their conversation was halting at first, two people climbing over years of silence, but somewhere between stories of community gardens and the Rosa Morales Fund, a bridge began to form. For the first time in a long while, he thought about legacy not as empire, but as the quiet relief in a stranger's kitchen when the lights stayed on. As for Eleanor, the numbers in her account remained startling, but they were no longer the center of her days. Mornings were filled with coffee and school runs and planning sessions for the fund, where she sat at the table not as a guest, but as a voice that mattered. Evenings were for homework, for recipes that smelled like Rosa's apron, for small prayers of thanks, whispered more easily now that fear had loosened its grip. She had not become someone else. She had become more fully herself, with room to stand upright and look the world in the eye. The real balance she carried was not on a bank screen, but in the way her heart stayed soft while her spine grew strong. And so, the woman once laughed at in a marble hall walked forward with a new kind of wealth, one made of choice, of dignity, of the power to turn pain into shelter for others. The billionaire who had pointed at her learned that some lessons arrive late, wrapped not in profit, but in humility and second chances. Somewhere between them, in the space where a trust fund became a trust between people, Rosa's quiet love kept working. If this story touched your heart, take a moment now. Click on one of the videos on your screen to continue this journey of kindness. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story of redemption, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice too can be part of someone's new beginning.